obviously a lot of the people in those memories are here today, which is nice as well. I mean, the whole concept of this book and everything that Bruce and I do is that, you know, we live in a special place. There's so much to learn and so much to share. Speaking personally, as a kid, I didn't really fully understand everything that was here, but as I got older and learned, you know, what we had here and the significance of what we had here for history, that's where, like, I wanted to share it with the world. And that's what started the history website, and one of the ways that Bruce and I got together as a team was to really share this history, and this book is our way of sharing history in a way that makes it fun. Because when we were growing up, it wasn't much fun, was it?
It's good to be back here. When I was a kid, this was the library. It wasn't anything except this room and part of it upstairs. I think it was accessible. We're both products of the Reading school system. And I don't know about Brent's experience, but my experience growing up in Reading was we had a great group of dedicated teachers. They weren't in it for the money. They weren't in it for the benefits because they didn't have either. They were in it to mold young minds and get us interested in learning, and taught us how to learn and how to research and how to find out more. And this is one of the things we wanted to do with this book, is we wanted to present some history, and we wanted to present it through first-person eyes of a 14-year-old boy who saw it firsthand. It's not an objective look at history, it's totally subjective through his eyes, because all you're going to learn about in this book when you read it is what he saw, not what, it's not a history textbook. It's a history of what went on in Reading during the winter of 1778 and 1779. So we try to make it as interesting as possible.
And also point out some of the things that you see in town and make them more interesting too. I mean, that was the other thing, and that's the fun thing that we got to play with, was that when you drive around town and this is what you see, whether you see Putnam Park or Gallows Hill or Zaman Reed's grave. I mean, this all ties into the story, and when you drive by these places again, we wanted you to really understand that this is interesting, and you can go here and you can, you know, relive the story, but also on your own you can, you know, do your own research, and then you can learn exactly what went on. I mean, Putnam Park's a great example. I mean, in the visitor center, you have, you know, the complete history of the park, and you have little notations about My Brother Sam is Dead, the book about it. I mean, the fans and neighbors of, friends and neighbors rather, fans of Putnam Park did a nice job of putting that back together for the public to really not only just go there and walk and have a great time in the woods, but also understand what went there way back when.
We wrote this to hopefully get parents and grandparents involved with their grandkids and kind of study the book together, read the book together, be able to travel places in Reading and see some of the places that actually represent the history, because there's an awful lot of them that are still standing that we can actually look at. We're extremely lucky in this town that one of the encampments has been completely restored, though not 100% accurately, but it's fairly accurate. The second one, we have a second one that's largely undisturbed. They've been doing some archaeological digs and stuff there. Unfortunately, the third encampment has been completely bulldozed and destroyed, and probably nobody even actually knew about it while they were building the houses in that particular area. But the fact that we've got two sites, as opposed to most places which have none, or they've got something that's a big national park tourist area, this is something you can go and explore and kind of go with your kids or grandkids and go through together.
Yeah, because it really was significant to have an encampment where you live. There's not many places that really had them. There weren't that many of them. You know, you have Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Connecticut. You have other smaller ones, but not of this significance. I mean, to have three was pretty big. To have it after Valley Forge, which was about when they started to do winter encampments correctly. So it is definitely more significant than you would think on the surface.
Well, the great significance about this particular one is Reading was a town of about 1,250 people in 1778. By the winter of 1778, December and January, there was about 4,500 people living in Reading because there was over 3,000 troops here. So that made a huge impact on such a small town. It was a big impact on the environment, The troops were not particularly well supplied. They had problems getting uniforms. Uniforms were supposedly made more locally, and they weren't up to the quality, so a lot of these soldiers were not ready or fit for duty at any one particular time. I think there was one report that came in from General Corps. There was 126 soldiers that had no boots in his brigade at all. That's just one brigade. So those are 126 men that were camped here in that particular time who were not fit to fight. You couldn't go out in the middle of the winter in your bare feet and fight the enemy.
And do not try that, I have. I don't know what they made feet out of that back then, but it took a long time by the fire to get these things, heated up again. And that's why we talked about, from the first person. Because there were so many different topics to discuss. From taverns where how communication was passed, how did people find out about things, why were the opinions one way or the other? If you were an Anglican church member, you may have felt a certain way about the war, but if you were a Presbyterian, which is now Congregationalist, you felt differently. So that's the kind of things that you'll see woven into the book, is those conversations and that information.
One of the things is, we're going to ask a few questions for you guys today and see what kind of answers they come up with. But what do you figure the best way of finding out current events in this town would have been in 1778? Absolutely.
I'd say tavern and church.
The tavern was probably the #1 place, because the taverns, they weren't just places to go drink, they were places where people who were traveling through spent the night. And that's how you found out news from other towns, is from other people who were traveling here. There was no daily newspapers, or obviously was no other form of regular communications. Most things that happened during that particular time period, people in Reading wouldn't have found out about them, sometimes for days, weeks, or even months after they happened, because there was just no way of communicating that stuff to them.
Right. And we also want to note that, we had post riders, which were people who came in with the mail, in and out, on horseback, obviously. So you get some information from them. But yeah, largely it was basically your circle of influence, your friends, your church, the tavern, and you formulate your own opinion on it. And we really wanted to bring that out in the book. And also, life was different back then. Even for the kids that we talk about, they had daily chores to do. A lot of kids don't have daily chores anymore. And they played a role in their family that made it work for their family.
And there was a lot more chores for kids to do in those days, because the older kids ended up going to work sooner, or they went off to war to fight the war. There was 86 enlisted men from Reading during the Revolutionary War. So there was 86 out of 1,250 people who weren't here. One thing that happened back then is the people who remained in town took care of the families of the people who went to war. Everybody took on some added responsibilities. They provided food, they provided firewood, they provided whatever sustenance the other people needed, because let's face it, if your dad went to war, there was no way that you could run your farm by yourself. And everybody had children. Most of the children, by the time they were 15 or 16, certainly by the time they were 17 or 18, they were usually out on their own. So you had big families, but they needed watching over and taking care of. So I said it was a tough time for people. You have big families. Thing that we don't think of so much today is as families, they'd have 7 or 8 kids, and only 3 or 4 or 5 of them would make it to adulthood. And we talked about that in the book. Our main character is one of 7 children, 2 of which have already passed away. His sister died of consumption when she was a young child, and his younger brother died by falling through the ice in the river and drowning. So life was tough.
Right. But it's all woven into the story, which helps you as a reader, learn it, but not learn it in cold hard facts, but learn it through the story. And so we try to mix in as much as we could into the story. Bottom left there is spying. That a big thing about what went on at Gallows Hill was because there was a lot of people playing both sides of the war because they really weren't sure which side was going to win. So a lot of information was being passed by people coming through encampments, and that was something that had to be fixed if the Americans were eventually going to win. Bruce is full credit for bringing in the classroom, the 1955 classroom, and that was brilliant because it really helped us in two ways. The reader doesn't get bored because we're bouncing back and forth. You can envision the stories being told in the classroom, and present-day students and parents and teachers get it. And that was our whole thing with the book. We wanted this book to become a vehicle for parents and teachers to help their kids, understand what happened here through the story.
I also brought in the classroom because we were telling the story through the form of a journal of a 14-year-old boy in 1778. He couldn't or wouldn't even think to take the time to explain what certain jobs were, what certain things that went on. He wouldn't have explained to people what a collier was because everybody would have known what a collier was. So we brought in the teacher so that the teacher, when she read this story to her children, her 6th grade class, that the kids could then ask questions and she could tell them what some of the terminology was, what some of the things about life in 1778 was that you wouldn't have gotten from a journal because he's telling it real time. He's not explaining his entire life, he's just talking about things that go on day by day. So the teacher brings in another aspect to help the, especially adolescents who read this book, understand what we're talking about.
Right. Yep. And that's really how we tied it all together. Plus, Bruce got to bring in some people from town in that time frame.
Yeah, most of the people that are in the 1955, either they were the classmates or teachers of mine.
Right.
Because I date back that far.
But that was the fun part.
Yeah,
really,
it was.
truly. And also, it was nice to weave in, the interaction between the teachers and the principal, and him being proud of the fact that kids are being taught this way. And so it was, it really helps, like I said, move the book along quickly and make it a lot more interesting than it could have been. We also wanted people to understand, how Reading was prior to the troops, basically, because Reading was completely different prior to the troops, and a lot of the big change came with the raid on Danberg.
Yeah, the raid on Danberg was probably the biggest changing point. Prior to that, in 1775, there was 140 some odd people that signed a letter, and they became the Reading Loyalist Association. And after the war started, at least a dozen of those guys switched sides and became patriots. There wasn't a big desire, I guess, for a lot of people to start a new country. If life was pretty good for them, you were fine under English rule. So it was pretty well split in town. I would say it was probably pretty close to half and half. It just so happened that most of the loyalists seemed to live on the ridge. More loyalists than not lived on the ridge, and they went to the Anglican Church. Patriots, most of them lived in the center of town, and they went to the Congregational Church. So there was a division, even though our founding fathers wanted to separate church and state in 1778. That was the least they weren't completely together. So I said we wanted to, show that, and the raid on Danberg was the biggest change because it's the first time that anybody in Reading saw a soldier. They woke up on April 26th or 7th of 1777, and there was 2,000 British soldiers all marching through town. They happened to stop on the ridge. They happened to, General Erskine, Agnew, and Tryon happened to have tea and wine, or wine and cakes, I guess, with William Heron, who lived right next to the Anglican Church. His house is now gone. There's a Cape Cod that sits there now.
It's where Jesse Sanford lived.
Yeah, where Jesse Sanford and Hank Sanford and those guys all grew up. But Heron was a guy that nobody knew whether he was a patriot or a loyalist. Because on the same day in 1777, he hosted the British in the morning and the Americans in the afternoon. Right. Both for a meal, both talking up how wonderful they were, how quickly the rebels would be quelled in the morning, right. And telling exactly where the British were headed and what they were planning to do.
And he knew, he must have been really good at what he did. The indications that I'm aware of is that we really didn't figure it out until some papers were found in the late 1800s.
Yeah, it was at least then, before it became fairly clear that he really was a
He
patriot.
was, yeah,
He was
because
a
it
patriot.
was really completely unclear, and he was brilliant too, and, you know, some people credit him, well, with the capture of Andre. He knew about what was gonna happen at West Point, Benedict Arnold, prior to that happening, and he was trying to tell people, and they didn't understand what he was saying. So he's a really neat individual. You know, his grave you can visit and Reading Ridge. But yeah, Reading Ridge is neat because we had the Church of England there, that's the Anglican Church, and, you know, why would you want to split with your own church? You know, what would happen to you next? I mean, obviously, things didn't go well, but that was a big problem for people that lived here, was that they had allegiance to their religion, their church. They're being told by their preacher that this is wrong, we can't do this. I mean,
Particularly with the Anglican Church, because the Reverend John Beach, even well after he was told to stop it, opened every sermon with a pledge of loyalty to King George III. And he was adamant about it. I mean, at gunpoint he was told to stop, and he didn't. He just kept right on going. They finally, in 1777, November of 1777, about probably 24, I guess, of the loyalists signed a pledge. And they signed a pledge that they would not discourage other people from joining the Continental Army, and that they would not aid the British, our enemy. And then they were allowed to kind of live in peace. And this is one of the things, that Reading was always a peaceful town. Nobody trusted anybody else. Everybody was worried about somebody else spying on somebody else. But the Loyalists and the Patriots lived in relative peace. And it wasn't until 1778, when the Army showed up, that all of a sudden some of the Patriots on the ridge started to get a little brazen. Because now they had an opportunity, that they had 3,000 soldiers in town that would back them up if they started to get a little carried away with taking advantage of the loyalists and stuff that were here. But also, when you had General Parsons, who was in charge of the middle encampment, which was between Gallows Hill and Limekiln, his building was at Betts's Tavern, which is right on the corner of Churchill Road and Route 58.
right.
That's pretty far away, but it's pretty obvious that the purpose of that was to be intimidating to the people who were still loyalists on the ridge, because he's right across from the Anglican Church. So that, I thought that was pretty significant.
And I think it's really neat because if you think about it, you know, William Perrin is across the street from both.
Yeah.
So he's seeing what's going on in both places, which is kind of interesting. So that, you know, the other thing that ties into the story is that, you know, all the supplies that are destroyed in Danbury are not available for the winter that they're coming here.
Right.
And that's a big thing. But yeah, Bruce is right. I mean, you even have notes from pastors to each other about how, you know, they work well together and everyone lives in, you know, relative harmony. So there wasn't a lot of animosity prior to the revolution, and things just got kind of hot when the soldiers were actually here. Now, why are the soldiers here? You know, that's another fun topic. And this is a map, obviously, I made for my work with my brother Sam is dead. But it shows that in the time period, these are kind of all the hot spots that are taking place in our area. Obviously, this is the North River or the Hudson River. You have the British down here, Horseneck, Stamford. You know, all these places are of big importance. And what happens prior to Reading is that Washington gathers all of his troops and all of his generals, and they really pretty much hang out on what's called Quaker's Ridge, which if you're a skier, it's called Thunder Ridge now. When we were growing up, it was Big Birch. That whole ridge was full of troops, I think about 17,000, and all the generals, they stayed there from September, early, mid-September, all the way until late November, deciding what they're going to do next. And what ultimately was decided was that they're going to basically form a crescent over the British to basically, you know, contain and observe them while they were down there. So you had troops in New Jersey, you had them at West Point, and you had them in Danbury and Reading. And that allowed movement to all the, important places, from the Sound all the way across.
Well, the British controlled the Sound, and the British controlled Long Island, and the British controlled New York City. So it was try to, like he says, form a collar around it, but Reading was chosen primarily because it was about equidistance between the Sound and West Point. And in the wintertime, you couldn't move troops very quickly because of the snows. I mean, you had to march through snow, they didn't plow the roads. So whatever was on the ground you had to do. Most of the time, both armies wintered over, and they just kind of healed and made themselves ready for the coming spring. But you couldn't trust that there wouldn't be a surprise attack at some place. So by having so many troops in Reading, it wasn't more than a day's march to either get them to West Point or get them down to New Haven or Fairfield or something like that. So when the British originally came and marched on Danbury, they thought it was going to be a lot easier than what it was. They thought there was a lot more loyalist sympathy in the area. And they didn't come to burn Danbury. They came to steal the supplies that were in Danbury. The problem was they didn't bring any horses and they didn't bring any wagons to move the supplies. They actually thought that they could recruit people in Danbury, they could recruit teamsters with their horses and their wagons to bring the supplies back to Westport. Actually, no, it was Fairfield at the time. Okay, Westport later. But if you look at the route that they took to get to Danbury, one would assume they wanted to use the same route to go back. And that would have been up basically what is today's Route 58 through Reading, over Hoyts Hill and Bethel, and into Danberg. And if you look at the logistics of it, there's only one river that needs to be crossed, and that's the Aspetuck, and that's down in Easton today by the Bluebird. That's the only decent-sized river that needs to be crossed, so it's very easy for the troops to walk across the river, even in early April when the rivers are running fairly high.
Right.
They were surprised when they got to Danbury and there were no wagons and there were no teamsters. Those guys knew that they were coming by the middle of the day, and most of them headed towards New Milford. So what they decided to do, if we can't steal the stuff, we're going to burn it. Well, this is probably not the best thing for the British, because people in Reading now started to fear the British. Before, they didn't really care one way or the other, but they burned Danbury. And on the way back, they got into a couple of battles in Richfield and another skirmish in Wilton and another one down closer to Campo. It posed a real threat all of a sudden that wasn't there, that the people of Reading certainly didn't perceive as being there prior to that.
Right, definitely. And so, I mean, that really, we also had the resources. If you think about it, we had the wood and we had, the waterways, and we had access to things that they needed, like salt. There's, they're making salt in the, Greenwich and Stamford area. We could protect the supplies that still exist in Danbury. We can protect the military hospital that's still in Danbury. And so, there's a lot of things that played into it. And obviously, we had the main roadways that we could get to these locations that needed help relatively quickly. So that, that really was, I think, the deciding factor. I mean, there's other, stories of Aaron Burr being familiar with our town and requesting that Putnam come to Reading to check it out, which he does in the summertime. He finds it, appealing. But that was the other thing for Bruce and I to tell you in the story was, think about the impact that would have on the people that lived here for the long term. I mean, not only the short term of having everyone here and taking everything that you own, but long term, you're losing all your lumber. You're losing a lot of supplies. They want to buy stuff from you, but they're going to give you an IOU, basically.
Well, this is another whole issue, is when they came, people in Reading, some of our characters are used to bartering for things between their neighbors, because the Continental dollar was worthless. It was not backed by any precious metals. When the new government needed money, they printed it. It was IOUs. Worse than that, during the war, they weren't even levying taxes on most people. The deal was that the taxation was going to start after the war was over. So before the war, we had representation or taxation without representation. During the war, we had representation without taxation. But I said it was by money being useless.
Right.
The people of Reading were not particularly happy to be supplying them with wood and other supplies. But they had no choice. The law was you take the Continental currency or go to jail.
Right. And that's why in the book you'll see, like the exchange with Jonas's dad and the officer. The officer wants Jonas's dad to start working right away, and he's like, "Whoa, I got clients to take care of first, and you're in second."
Right.
But because he knew that he had to take care of his own first. I mean, and that was true of anyone, because they weren't going to get anything out of whatever they were doing for their troops.
Well, I don't know how many of you have seen pictures of Reading, even from around the turn of the last century, in the 1880s to the early 1900s. Reading was very much clear-cut. And a lot of the clear-cutting came during the Revolution. A lot of the clear-cutting in the northern part of the town came when they needed to cut timber to build the huts. They built 116 huts at the eastern encampment, which is now Putnam Park alone. You had 2 other encampments that were a little bit smaller, but that's a lot of timber that needs to be cut for that. They had to make charcoal there was at least 3 blacksmith shops at a blacksmith at each one of the encampments that needed charcoal to be able to do the repairs, shod the horses, make bayonets, whatever they needed to do during that particular winter. They needed charcoal for the ovens, for the bakers to be able to do that. And they said they needed all that timber, and they needed firewood. And the Army's attitude was like, cut whatever is closest to the camps. It was getting to be, when they didn't get here till mid-November.
Right.
And by the time they really started in earnest to putting these cabins and stuff together, was middle to late November, and by then it was raining and snowing like crazy. It was one of the things we did. We researched the weather from journals and stuff that we read at the time to see how miserable the weather was at that particular time. And winter came early that year. And because it came early, they couldn't move anything any distance. So they had to do everything as close to the camps as possible. So one of our main characters in the book, John Fairchild, who owns a sawmill and he owns large stands of timber, he's forced to cut everything, including the younger trees that he would like to keep to have grow, so that he's got 3, 4 boys that he's hoping will take over his business someday, while all his timber is going to be gone by that particular winter. So he's not a particularly happy camper.
Right. No, so and that's where the research really went in. So all the historians here, you guys all played a role in helping us. The thing that you find in history is that it's constantly changing, because new information gets found all the time.
Well, one of the books that most people that study Reading rely upon is Todd's History of Reading. And if you look at his first edition, it was made he wrote it in 1880, and it was literally this thick. He wrote his second edition in 1906, and it's this thick. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of information that he found in there. One of the things that I found really interesting was the accounts of the executions on Gallows Hill. In the first edition, he wrote only of the brutality that appeared that Putnam showed towards the 2 men that he wanted to make an example of. And in the second edition, he had a completely different account, another account. He had both accounts in there. But I like the fact that he left both accounts in there for the reader to make up his own mind as to which one maybe happened, or maybe it was something in between. Because most history of that time, it was all oral histories.
Right.
You learn stuff from your grandparents, and your grandparents are telling stories that their parents told and their grandparents told. A lot of it hadn't been written down. It was only 100 years out when you get into, in the middle 1800s. And the history was then starting to be recorded. Before that, there wasn't a lot of it. There was records that the armies had kept, but there wasn't a lot of other things that other historians had started to do at that particular time. So it was a lot of hearsay, and there's a lot of history that you probably read as kids, or even as adults, in books that were written even into the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. A lot of that information has since been proven to be not factual. And we tried, and I'm sure we've got some things in there.
We got coyotes.
People can, yeah, we have coyotes in there. This is kind of funny.
This is like the joy of being an author.
Yeah. It took Brent and I a while to find the coyotes in there. There's this one sentence in the book where they go out and they find some animal remains that had been picked clean by either wolves or coyotes. Well, somebody that Brent sent the book to made a big point, like 10 paragraphs worth or something like that.
So yeah, I served
There were
on
no coyotes here in 1778. They weren't introduced into Connecticut.
it was just one of those things where, like, it was one of those things where you're reading the letter and you just go, oh. Because it's not what you expected. And your hopes were this high because I served with him on the Historical Society board. He's a well-accomplished man. I read all his books and I was like, finally get to my own book, and here it is, and I hope you enjoy it. And
well, he was very praising of the book, other than the damn coyotes.
And then the coyotes. And then I was like, where were the coyotes? So then we're going crazy trying to find the coyotes. Yeah, it's interesting.
It took me until half a day yesterday. I'm rereading the book, and I finally picked it up to page 202.
I found it. Yeah, so it's fun. Now, as far as characters go, I use the rock that's up on the ridge because it has a couple of last names like Fairchild. I mean, we tried to use as many local names as we could within the book in terms of being, historically correct. And then Bruce did a great job in the book with the language that they used because we really don't know how they talked or what words they really, would have used in conversation every day. And that's where you came up with
I tried to bring it somewhere in between probably how they really talked and how people could understand it today. Because again, we aimed this book towards a lot of adolescents, though probably more adults have read it by far than adolescents up to this point. But we want them to have somewhat of a flavor of what it was like, and particularly since we put it in a journal, we wanted the kid to talk hopefully like he would have talked in 1778.
Right.
So
you came about as close as, you came pretty darn close.
as realistically as I think that we could come without
confusing you.
Without confusing you.
You want to talk about any characters?
Well, the characters, let me get to it. Our main character obviously is Jonas. He's a 14-year-old boy who has been encouraged by his teacher to write. He's in his last year of school here. He's a bright kid, and he described himself as the forgotten child, the one that no longer requires constant looking after, yet the one who isn't considered quite old enough to handle a full day's work. And in the 4 or 5 months that we go over this book, you see Jonas grow and mature, doing silly things that kids would do early on, like just traveling with his buddy over to the ridge when they hear that there's soldiers there to find out information at the tavern. Well, he's going in a time of war, he's going to the loyalist country, and he's obviously a patriot. It's not the smartest thing that he ever did, but he starts to grow. He pays the price. He has to
cut 4
deliver 4 cords of wood for some lady. And he pays that price, but then he starts to realize that he has to act more maturely. And over the course of the winter, his father and he have more conversations, and the kid, you can see the kid grow, and you can see his father give him more responsibilities, knowing that within the next year, he's kind of be out on his own. He's going to be treated as an adult because he's going to be acting like an adult. And then you got his father, John, who's much more of a pragmatist than anything else. He's definitely a patriot, but he's a pragmatic patriot. He doesn't like the fact that he has to get paid in Continental dollars because he says, I take the money in my right hand, and he says from the time it goes out into my right hand for getting paid till the time it leaves it in the left hand, he says it's worth a third less than just over the course of the evening. You see that he's very upset because he normally supplies his children with a new pair of boots every winter. This particular year they had a banner year as far as work because they were cutting timbers for all the burned buildings in Danberg. They got all this work for the Army, but he's getting paid in Continental dollars, and he has less to show for it at the end of the year than he did the year before. So his father, I said, is not particularly happy with having the soldiers come. And he's very, very concerned, particularly when the soldiers come and there's shots fired inside the Anglican church that doesn't seem to affect the Reverend Beach at all. He goes right on with his sermon. The bullet whizzes by his head and goes right into the sounding board behind. But his father says, like a copperhead snake that lives in peace on the rocks on our ridges and only strikes when he feels threatened, so might be the loyalists that remain in Reading. So he's very concerned that while they've lived in peace for the first 2.5 years during the war, that all of a sudden neighbors may come to fight neighbors.
Right.
And
Can I
then,
ask a question?
sure.
When you mentioned the young man was obviously a revolutionary, you know, not a loyalist, how could it be obvious? Did he have an armband or something?
No, it's just his family were loyalists. They lived in the center. They were Congregationalists. Pretty much everybody in Reading knew everybody else, and they knew what their political leanings were, what their feelings were. And I said they got along, but there was distrust. Everybody thought everybody else could be a possible spy.
But would the soldiers recognize him for?
Not the soldiers,
a
but
spy?
the loyalists. The loyalists that were on the ridge could give him some trouble. That's what they were afraid of. If his parents were particularly concerned because they didn't know, the boys had seen soldiers from the Continental Army who had come to Reading who were going to start to set up the camps. They had no idea if the British were coming. And if the British were to come, and the first time the British went through, you see some of the names that are on there. Some of those people, these are people that the British took in April of 1777, and some of them were young boys. Tryon's motto was young boys grow into be soldiers. So he didn't like, if he thought a young boy was a patriot, he captured him, and they took him and they put him in prisons. And the prisons at the time in New York, where most of the prisons were, they were all sugar houses. And a very good number of those people, if they were there for any length of time, contracted diseases and died. And there's at least one of those boys who did die in
He was
prison.
19 or so.
He was 18 or 19 years old. He wasn't a soldier, and he died in July of 1777. So within 3 months of being captured. So it wasn't wise for people to travel along unaccompanied, I would say, particularly kids.
Right.
And then we've got Tom Worrups, who was a Native American. And the Indian story, I think, in Reading is particularly interesting because the Native Americans sold all the land north of Cross Highway to the settlers.
Well, they're on deeds, yeah.
On deeds. They didn't realize, Indians didn't own land. They didn't have titles to land. They didn't even think about it. But the settlers knew that the Indians occupied those lands, and they wanted to buy the land, so the land was then theirs. Well, the Indians weren't stupid. They said, "Do you want to pay me for the land? Sure, I'll put my X on your deeds." Didn't change how they lived. They still lived on the same lands. They still hunted on the same lands. But basically, the ones that were in that particular area, most of the tribal people had really moved on. A lot of these people were sort of outcasts.
They're from everywhere.
They were pretty much from everywhere, and they were opportunists. And they took advantage of whatever opportunity came along, and Tom Worrups was one of them.
And chickens,
Chickens was his grandfather, wasn't it, I think?
Who knows?
Because Tom Worrups was a real person.
That's where it gets real confusing, as Stuart would know well. But a lot of the deeds that we've read, they really say in the deed that they're going to be there, and their children are going to be there, and they're going to use the land. And so, but it was good. We thought it was important to have Tom Worrups involved in the story.
Yeah, well, the boys in the young boys all like Tom because he tells really interesting stories, and a wealth of information of local history and how the Indians live and just natural occurrences and stuff like that. The adults didn't necessarily trust him.
Well, he's got the environment, fishing, hunting.
Right.
He's got all those neat things that kids like.
Yeah. I said, and obviously we've got William Heron again, who was a real person who was, at the time, nobody in town trusted him because he played both sides against the middle. He did turn out in the long run to be a loyalist, but like Brent said, that wasn't found until papers were discovered in the 1870s or 1880s.
Well, patriot. Well, he was discovered to be a real patriot.
Right. There was documentation that was found where he was given held in high regards for the accomplishments that he had helped the Continental Army with.
Right. And he plays in. I mean, like if you watch Netflix, watch Turn. Turn's a great spy network, series that I'm addicted to. Drives my wife crazy, but it's a really interesting look at that time period, I think. But yeah, because I always think of him because it all makes sense. But no, I mean, working with Bruce on this book has been, truly, everything we do, we've done together, and we feed off each other with ideas. Nothing could say that better than the cover.
We haven't had one serious disagreement about anything.
No, not really. And
Our wives probably find
well,
that
the only
amazing.
disagreement we had was that Bruce thought I was dragging my feet, and I had all these other things in the fire, and I was the president of the historical society. So then he took on two historical society, jobs, if you will, and then he learned, a lot of what I was going through, and that helped. But it got to a point though where we needed to either just give up or get going on the cover. So we had talked about all the different ways we were going to publish the book, and we just kept on looking at each other like, we're going to spend $3,000 to make back $3,000, and that doesn't work. And then
Or 8,000 make back 3,000.
yeah, so we found that Amazon had a program where you could, give them your manuscript, give them your artwork, they make you the book, and then you sell it at will, and that's what we came into. So he basically was riding me for a cover. So one day I kind of had to just shut off all my phones and devices and say, okay, here we go. So what I thought about was, what's it like, you're the kid in the book, like how do we make this cover so you feel like you're there? And the picture to your left is actually Prairie Valley Forge. But what stood out to me was to the right of it. So I just cropped the right side, and I thought to myself, that looks great because you can imagine 14-year-old boys and girls spying on, the troops. But I wasn't like 100% on it. Like the biggest thing that stuck out to me was the creepy eye. Yeah, that creepy eye. And it was driving me crazy, but it was okay. So then we used social media and Facebook really to see what other people thought. And we're like, yeah, that's not too bad. And but then Bruce, he can find anything online. Anything that you need online, he'll find it. And he found a better picture. With a better eye, a better horse, and then he put the blue color in, and the blue color really speaks to the cold, and you really feel it. And so then we started playing with fonts, and we get feedback from people online.
Boy, did we get a lot of feedback.
Oh yeah.
Everybody was an expert on font.
But at the end of the day, though, it turned out pretty well. I mean, that's we produced that ourselves. That didn't cost us anything with time, but that's about it. And and so that's been the great, the beauty of it. And then we produced a book that, we got it back, and we're like, it's not bad. That's legit, and
well, the good thing is the people that we sent it out to, and we sent it out to probably 40 or 50 different people total. Yeah. And the feedback was pretty much all positive. Yeah. I had a couple of, and we had asked some of our, I've got a couple of friends that have written books for younger people, and I was told that we should dumb it down a little bit. And I dug in my heels on that because I think that kids that are 11, 12, 13 years, 14 years old are a lot brighter than a lot of people give them credit for. You see them, kids playing on their video games and everything, it doesn't mean that they don't have a brain and they can't engage and they can't read something, they can't understand something that's presented in a more adult fashion. And we did not want to make this into a kids' entertainment book. We wanted to make it into something that they would learn something from, and that they would get something out of it, and they would want to learn more. And the basic thing is
you guys did a great thing with My Brother's Hand is Dead, and that's really what this kind of ties to. Because that's how I really fell in love with the history of the Revolutionary War, was through this book, and all the stories told within it. And that's when, but I read the book, I think I was 33 when I read it again. I was like, oh, I understand what they're doing now. And that's why I did all the resources that I did for the book, was to help others understand in each chapter, what's going on and what's important and what you can talk to your kids about or what you can think about or do research on your own. And that's kind of like what we hope that this book can do moving forward, is really talk about why certain information in each and every chapter and then provide you resources to help you if you wanted to learn more about it.
And we wanted this to be as historically correct as we could make it, as how it relates to Reading. My brother Sam has got stuff that relates to Reading, it's not as historically,
We want to, yeah,
it's
we
not
want
as
to,
historically accurate as what we wanted.
and we want it to be Reading, you know.
Right.
And like the library played a huge role in that because, you know, Stuart, you and Kathleen's research is all downstairs. All the things that you did with the archaeology is right there. You can go through and see a lot of the different topics that have evolved over the years. Then you had a whole resource, a cultural resource, right?
History and archaeology.
In Reading, yeah, which was also a big
There's not
help.
a day goes by that I don't use 2 or 3 things that Stuart wrote or had at hand or recorded.
Yeah, and you know, Dan Cruzon too. I mean, we've learned from all the historians, and now, you know, the whole thought was to keep it going, you know? Once you stop telling the story, people tend to forget. I can't tell you how many times I've gone down to Georgetown and no one knows what those buildings were. So, you know, once the story stops, it goes away. And that's what we don't want to happen with this, and, you know, hopefully, if we're lucky, we can keep it going. So, I really appreciate all of you that have come here today. But you probably have tons of questions for us, I would hope.
Yeah, hope so.
Yes.
On the very first slide,
Yep.
in the lower right-hand corner, looks like there's a cannonball embedded in a post. What is that?
That is Keeler Tavern. So Keeler Tavern is my favorite place to go when I have kids because they have a lot of great programs. They have a lot of, you know, basically a lot of teachers that are retired that teach you, you know, what the house was, and they give you a tour of the inside and the outside. When you go to the outside, there is a basically a siding piece that they take off, and that's the ball that was embedded in that house in the Battle of Richfield in 1777. So it's a good tie-in to, you know, what we're talking about with, you know, history being alive. We take private schools there. The gunnery is one that does it the most. And what we do is we park at the Keeler Tavern, and we take them on a bus tour down to where Worcester was shot. Excuse me, a bike tour, and we kind of stop all along the way. And the beauty is by the end, they're all sucking wind on their bikes. And then we say we stop and we just go off because of the road noise is pretty high. And we say, now imagine you've walked from Norwalk, Westport to Danbury, and now you're walking back. You rode a bike. They're walking the entire way. Their muskets weigh 15 pounds. They're being shot at. I mean, you know, can you imagine what it was like? So it really brings it to life for them. And then the staff at the Keeler Tavern takes over and tells them all about what it was like to live in that area. So it's a great day of, you know, being immersed in history kind of thing. But yeah, I would definitely, if you haven't been in Keeler Tavern in a while, they're really doing a great job over there. Yes.
As a work of history or historical fiction, is there another author or another book that you might say is a good analog for what you've done here that's put in our heads?
Like locally?
No, any book in general, just, you know, what's this like? Another way of putting it.
Oh, I don't know.
I don't know, the 2 things that I had in mind while I was working on this was Anne Frank's diary and the Red Badge of Courage. And those are the 2 things that kept in the back of my mind that I wanted to kind of keep them along. I was like, and one of the reasons I didn't want to dumb it down is because you read Anne Frank's diary. She started out when she was 12 years old. And if that's not the most mature recollection of real history that you'll ever see, that's why I did not want to make it look like some kid was writing it it was something, it just is fun little life.
Thank you.
I'm interested in what percentage of the soldiers died in the encampment, in the Putnam encampment that winter? Because we hear about how harsh it was, Connecticut's Valley Forge, but I don't have any information about, you know.
26 or so was one of the numbers. Any numbers you know, Stu? No, I mean, we know that at least 26 died, but yeah, you'd think that more would have passed. Yes,
And
ma'am.
why, I just want, part 2.
Sure.
Why did they call Gallows Hill, I live on Gallows Hill, why did they call it Gallows Hill when they only hung 2 people?
They only hung 1 person.
Why
Shot
did
him.
they
They
named
shot the
Gallows
other. Because they made a gallows. He wanted, Putnam, one thing he wanted to do, there was a real problem during that winter in that there was desertion and there was thievery, and a lot of the local people were losing cows and hogs and stuff like that because the soldiers were hungry. And it had to stop as far as he was concerned because it was getting out of control and things weren't getting any better in his camps. So the way to stop it is they caught one young man over in Richfield or Westchester, that was Jones, and he was supposedly out looking to, he was a butcher for the British Army, and he was supposedly out looking to buy a cow or something that he could butcher. And they detained him and they accused him of spying. And he denied being a spy until they hung him. And the other one was a deserter, and that is John Smith. And most deserters would have either spent time in a stockade or been flogged, or both, but certainly not killed. And he wanted to make an example of these two young men. So Jones, he built a 20-foot high gallows on Gallows Hill, which is now Gallows Hill. And the reason supposedly did it is because you can see it from a very long distance, especially when it was clear cut. He made every soldier from all three camps walk by those men after they were killed, so that they all saw them. And he invited as many people from the town to come and see that as they wanted to. It was a pretty big deal. They closed the schools. People, that's like, go watch the executions. Smith was shot at fairly close range, 3 musket balls into his chest, and it was close enough range that it set his clothing on fire. He dropped down, face first, rolled over, and he was still alive, and another soldier shot him in the head, put him out. But it was called Gallows Hill. There was only the one hanging there, and that's all evidently they needed. Because after that, most of the rest of the soldiers behaved fairly well for the rest of the winter. And it's also interesting to note, there were only a total of 4 people that died in Reading during the war. You had, in 1777 in April, when the British were marching towards Danberg, they ran into a messenger who was coming from Colonel Cook in Danbury with a message to General Sullivan in Fairfield, and he was at the bottom of Couch's Hill, which is now Sunset Hill. And the British ran into him, they shot him. He didn't die right away, but he did die from his injuries within the day. And you have 2 executions, and then you have one other soldier that tried to escape from the stockade, which was on Upawag Road at the time, after Putnam had sort of quelled a rebellion where soldiers had started to leave camp and they were going to Hartford to protest the fact that they weren't getting paid, that they didn't have any uniforms, and they weren't eating very well. He brought them all back. A couple of them put up a fight. One of them that put up a fight tried to escape, and he was shot, and he died from his injuries. But there were only a total of 4 that were actually killed in the town of Reading during the entire war.
Going back there.
Can you speak?
I wanted to answer the question on number of deaths.
Okay.
There were 27 soldiers who died at Putnam Memorial or Camp Reading. We found that out basically in 2008 in a dig at Putnam Memorial. At first, when the park first opened, they thought it was a graveyard. And then we got some documentation that kind of different, so we did a dig to confirm. What it was the firebacks of the 2 of the generals hut, who happened to be a clinic. We found pharmaceutical vials. So it's not a graveyard there.
Right.
Can you speak to how children were educated during that time? You mentioned that the main character, his teacher told him to start a journal.
Right.
Were they
Education back then,
homeschooled, or did they go to a central location? or-
No, there was, at that time, there was about 7 probably schoolhouses
Really?
in Reading, 6 or 7. It eventually ended up being about 11 or 12 or 13, it was a lot.
You know, you didn't have buses back then, so
Yeah.
it tended to be in a
Schools.
different neighborhoods, you know,
Right.
and then.
Schoolhouses had to be close to where the kids lived.
Right.
You had one-room schoolhouse, you had teachers. Teachers needed no formal education whatsoever. I found censuses from Reading where we had teachers as young as 16 years old. So they would graduate or finished their study, they didn't really graduate so much, but they finished their studies. And if they were bright enough and they wanted to teach, and they were willing to work to do it, because it didn't pay very much, almost nobody that was married was a teacher. They were all single, mostly single young men or single young men. Single young men or single young women, yeah.
So similar to the house that's on Hawaii, the schoolhouse that's on Hawaii.
Yeah, that was built a little, that was, what year was that? That was,
Yeah.
so, yeah, that was built right after the war, I think. Yeah.
Now, they're smaller than you would expect, the houses, and, you know, it was children of all ages being taught, you know, all in just that one little schoolhouse.
And they taught them year-round, too. You could go whenever it was sort of convenient for you, because they had summer sessions as well. Because students, a lot of them, because they worked on farms, they had help with the harvest, or they had help with the planting. Grades weren't as demarcated as they are today. And then if you wanted to go for a higher education, if you went to someplace like Yale, you studied theology, law, or medicine. And, you know, in those years, we didn't have as broad of an education system.
Right.
And there were no high schools as such for rural towns at all.
So I know that Putnam had a seizure in the winter of 1788 or 1778, and that removed him from duty. But what was he doing for the next 11 or 12 years until his death in 1790? Does anyone know?
Anyone want to answer that one?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
It's out of our level of education.
I don't know.
Yeah.
So, okay.
I was looking at the Historical Society website before I came, and there was an interesting letter from someone that said he had relatives that were given the opportunity to leave and go live in New Brunswick, loyalists. So if you were loyal to the crown and the place, you know, became American, you could move away.
In August of 1783, there was about 18 or 19 people in Reading who were tossed out because they had loyalist connections and they had either fought for the Queen's Rangers or they had supported the crown more than the people of Reading thought that they should have. Some people were allowed to return and still live here. If you fled and went to Long Island or something during the war, your land was almost always usually confiscated by the state and then resold. In 1783, there was a good number of people, I said, in Reading, Ridgefield, everything else, and they said they were tossed out of town. They went to Long Island. They waited around on Long Island. They got on boats and they all went to Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. And they weren't real happy when they got there because the island that they landed on near Fredericton in New Brunswick was about this far above the river. And it was in the middle of the summer and they realized that they better get off of there before the spring came because they were going to be underwater. And they were all given, I think the land grants were about 600 acres or something like that they were given. I'm not sure. They were given pieces of land. There's one house in Reading, Daniel Morehouse. He's one of the ones that was thrown out in 1783. He built a house identical to it. It is now in King's Landing in New Brunswick, which is just outside of Fredericton. It's absolutely identical to the house that he lived in on Poverty Hollow Road when he was a kid. He didn't build it until 1812, but he remembered what that house looked like and he built it so that it was an exact replica.
We have time for one more question, and then we're going to adjourn downstairs for the reception.
So,
I wonder if you have got any idea, or I'm sure that you do have an idea, about how many people were loyalists, how many people were patriots, and how many people just wanted to go about their daily life.
I don't know. There's not. The loyalists, there was 141 people that signed a letter of loyalty to the crown in 1775. Not all of them stayed loyal, and not everybody who was loyal to the crown signed that letter. As far as numbers, I don't think there was any.
I mean, anyone who was doing fairly well didn't want to rebel, really. I mean, that's pretty much what it played into. You know, why would they want to? You know, they were doing fine. They didn't see any problems. So, you know. That was a big problem for them because now, you know, they may lose everything that they had. And my brother Sam is dead. That's the big reason why the father is killed, because he just wants to live, you know, like he's always lived. He doesn't want to deal with it, and that's, you know, that's what really eventually gets him.
The hard numbers that we have come from enlistments in the armies, and there were 86 men from Reading during the war between 1775 and when it was officially over in 1783, but really in 1781. There were 86 men from Reading who enlisted and served in the Continental Army. There were 64 men that served in the militia. The militia was more like the home guard. And some of those men didn't show up when they were called. When we burned Fairfield, there was at least 8 or 10 of those guys that ended up getting arrested and fined because they didn't go to defend Fairfield. 20 of the loyalists fled and left the town completely, just abandoned it. And 6 of those particular people ended up, that we know of, it could be higher, but we know 6 of those people joined the British Army. And we thank you very much, Stu, because that information was in your information this morning.
And that's the other thing too, that kind of, I forgot about that, you bring it up. Just after the troops leave, so the troops leave around May or June of 1779. In July, the British burned from Fairfield all the way down to Norwalk. All those towns burned. And so it was almost like they got back at that.
Yeah.
It's wild.
We want to thank everybody so much for coming. This was a lot of fun to talk with you all.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you, Bruce and Brett.